Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're back in the world of the Romans, or more specifically in this case, the world of the Dacians and the Thracians. And what I've got here is a FALX, or is it? Well, I'll come back to that in a little bit. So this is from Iamandi Knife, so linked below. You can go check out, he's a knife maker in Romania, so what was Dacia. Go and check out his stuff. He's making all sorts of weapons of this type, but also he is making modern knives and various other types of knives as well. So he's a very skilled chap, and he very kindly sent me one of these. Now, these have been featured on at least a couple of other YouTube channels as well, so you might have seen similar ones to this before. Now, this does get commonly called a FALX, and FALX is probably the most common name that people associate with this type of weapon. But is it a FALX? Well, when I came to research these, I found that it's a bit of a minefield, quite simply because we've got conflicting historical documents, texts, talking about weapons like this, both from Dacia and from Thracia. Over a long period of time, there are two main artistic sources of the period that people refer to, the Tropaeum Traiani and Trajan's Column, and there's some differences between those two, both in terms of how the weapons are represented but also how they're used, in addition to which we've got some confusion about different sizes of these, and we've got some quite nice examples of weapons like this from archaeology, and there is quite a bit of variation between those as well. So the first thing to mention, I suppose, there are three main things to focus on here. One is size of, well, size of entire weapon, but size of blade as well, curvature, and hilt construction, or hilt design, shall we say. Now, those three things show us, if we look at the archaeology, we look at the art, and we look at the written sources, show us that there's quite a bit of variation in these things. If we just look at hilt construction for a moment, so you will see that this is very nicely made with artistic renditions of art, perhaps Dacian inspired art of the time, and it has a sort of rib, should we call it, halfway down the grip, a bit like a long sword might have, or a bastard sword, to stop, if you're using it one-handed, to stop the hand sliding down. And there is some evidence for that historically, but I'll come back to that in a second. So there are various different types of hilt constructions found in the archaeology. First of all, there are different tang constructions. We find almost full-width tangs, or indeed full-width tangs, and we find essentially a through tang, a stick tang, which is peened at the end. Now, this is sort of has characteristics of both of those constructions, in that the tang does come through to the end, but it's not peened or rolled over or anything like that at the end, it's just visible at the end. But then we have a rivet through there and a rivet through there, through two ferrules. Now, there is some archaeological evidence for that kind of construction. However, what I came across, what seemed to be the most common forms of hilt construction, are a tang which goes all the way through, like a medieval sword, with a stick tang, essentially a through tang, that tapers, so it's thicker at this end and it gets thinner towards the end of the butt or the pommel, and then at the end is sort of peened or riveted or rolled over in some way, sometimes with some kind of cap at the end. The other form of construction is with pretty much a full width tang, where you sometimes find three rivets through, and the three rivets are like with like a kitchen knife, conventional kitchen knife grip, or indeed certain types of Bowie knife. You have a rivet through here, a rivet through here, and a rivet through here, and then these ferrules, if you want to call them that, are put in to prevent the grip splitting, but they don't usually have the rivets through them. This construction, the rivets have gone through the ferrules, which is a very strong form of construction, but I'm not going to pretend that it's necessarily historically common, and I don't know what the historical evidence for that is. So the basic headline is there are various forms of grip and hilt construction found in the originals, and that obviously creates a certain degree of disagreement and controversy when people are talking about these weapons, because we have quite a lot of variation within a fairly small data set, which is a bit problematic. But anyway, additionally, we sometimes have very long grips for weapons that are clearly primarily supposed to be used two-handed, and then we have some very short grips that are obviously weapons that are meant to be used pretty much only one-handed. I'll talk about the names of these in a second, and there is some evidence for a middle rib on some grips, both in art and archaeology, like this example here. So some of them may have been used a bit like longswords, sometimes in one hand, sometimes in two. Now the names of these, this is problematic. So we have three main names which are associated with weapons like this. One of them is the FALX, which I've mentioned. The other one is the Sica, which I've referred to in gladiatorial videos that I've done. Check those out if you haven't done already. And the Sica is a one-handed sword, most famously used, I think, actually in gladiatorial contexts, used by the Thracian gladiator. But the reason is because it's used by Thracians and in fact Dacians as a one-handed weapon used with a large shield, not unlike the Roman scutum, very similar, although usually oval rather than rectangular like this later imperial one. And the Sica is a contrast to the straight sword, so the straight sword which would be used, for example, by the secutor or provocator, the curved blade would be used by the Thracian and is characteristic to the Thracian, and possibly the Dimachurus as well. So there is a one-handed version of this, but that's not to say that this isn't used one-handed, and in fact the fact that we've got a rib here and there are some archaeological examples like that and art examples like that suggest that some of these longer handled ones were used either one-handed or two-handed. So we've got the FALX and we've got the Sica. The Sica seems to always be one-handed. The FALX, the jury's a bit open as to what exactly that refers to. It could be a generic word that could mean two-handed ones and one-handed ones. And then we've got the Rhomphaia. Now the Rhomphaia is usually associated with the Thracians rather than the Dacians. A neighbouring culture, obviously with some shared cultural heritage, and their weapons have some things in common as well. Now if you look on the internet and various forums, Wikipedia and everywhere like that, the general statement that people make is that the Rhomphaia is a large two-handed version of the FALX. Not to say that the FALX isn't two-handed, but should we say the Rhomphaia tends to be even larger and tends to be less curved and perhaps even sometimes straight. Now confusing this whole subject is that in later Byzantine times the Rhomphaia is a word which is repeatedly used for a large two-handed sword, sometimes one-edged, in fact usually one-edged, but sometimes two-edged as well. So the word, this is the problem we get into linguistics, is that sometimes the words, what may mean FALX to one person doesn't necessarily mean FALX to another, or Rhomphaia or Sica. So it's a complicated subject and there's much debate about this. Even when we look at the art sources, some people argue that Trajan's column isn't a reliable representation of Dacian equipment, but the Tropaeum Traiani is perhaps more reliable. And there are big differences in how the Dacian arms and armour are shown in each of those sources and how they're shown used in each of those sources as well. But they are the two main artistic sources that we have to go from. So we've got a very small data set, and as always in history and archaeology, when you've got a small data set, then you're going to get debate, you're going to get arguments. So I'm going to speak in more or less general terms here, and I'm going to call this a FALX because that's probably the most commonly understood word. And a lot of people know about the FALX. It's quite a famous weapon from the classical era, from the Roman era, because of Trajan's column. And Trajan's column is a widely used and referenced work of Roman art that glorifies the Dacian campaign and Trajan's campaign, and it's used in a lot of books, and therefore a lot of people are familiar with seeing this combat between the Romans and the Dacians. And there's another fact that a lot of people know about the FALX, and that is that it is possibly the only weapon, or at least one of the only weapons, that definitely brought about changes in Roman equipment whilst on a military campaign. And famously, the thing that most people, if they know this fact, know about is that the Roman helmets, the culus, had a crosspiece or cross pieces put onto the top of the helmets, and there's archaeological evidence from surviving examples that these cross pieces were added not at manufacture, they've been added after and therefore on campaign as a response to the effects from this FALX. And indeed any of you who know about this weapon or have paid any attention to this weapon at all will have probably seen videos or at least photographs on the internet of these being tested on everything from dead pigs to Roman shields to Roman helmets to lorica segmentata, the plate arm of the Roman imperial period. So this is quite a famous weapon of the Roman era, and it has received a fair amount of exposure online. And I will be doing some cutting with this. Don't fear of that. But quite a lot has been done with these already and has shown the fearsome abilities of these, and the fearsome cutting ability of these are well documented in texts of the time, both the wounds that they gave but also the damage that they do to the armour, and we know this also from archaeology. And in addition to the Roman helmet being adapted potentially against these, and not necessarily just against the power of the edge, it might be the power of that point penetrating through, which I think is a large likelihood from my own experiments with armour penetration with weapons. It's also fairly well documented that other changes were brought into Roman equipment at this time. Perhaps next most famous is the inclusion of the manica. So the right arm, but during the Trajan's campaign, it started wearing the manica on legionaries' arms to protect their arms from cuts from weapons like the Sica and the FALX. And this is essentially a piece of gladiatorial equipment worn by most types of gladiator that use a sword and a shield to protect the right arm. It probably most of the time involves plates, either of iron or bronze, but could perhaps in some cases just have been padding or with leather. The jury's out on this. There's lots of debates also about that topic, about how exactly the typical manica was constructed and worn. So the manica was brought in, and there are potentially some other differences they brought into equipment as well. I have read in a couple of places, and I can't verify this for myself because I haven't researched this particular topic myself, that the body armour, there was a greater use of lorica hamata, so that's mail, and squamata as well, so scale, in the Dacian campaign, instead of lorica segmentata. Now, why should that be the case? I don't know, and this is why I don't necessarily trust what I've read online about this being a response to the Dacian campaign, because generally speaking, the lorica segmentata will provide better protection against weapons like this, both in piercing and in cutting and just in impact. The lorica segmentata is, in my view, a better armour against that sort of thing. But there is some suggestion that the lorica hamata, and of course hamata is mail, commonly known as chainmail, like this here, so riveted interlocking links. That is good excellent cut protection, pretty good thrust protection, although probably not quite as good as the segmentata. And there is some suggestion that they wore a beefed up subarmalis, so a padded garment underneath the mail to give a bit more kind of shock absorption, energy absorption underneath the mail, because mail by itself does absorb some impact but not a huge amount. So this was an influential weapon and continues to be. Now I want to talk a little bit about its use. So if you look online to people who've reviewed these or used these, they pretty much always use them as a two-handed implement. But actually, if we compare, this is the Dynasty Forge Gladius, incidentally, which is not a very good replica, but it's the one I have to hand. And this is a little bit on the large side for typical Roman gladii of the period. But you'll notice that the weapon is not really much longer, this one anyway, isn't much longer than the gladius, especially when we consider that generally speaking this is a chopping weapon, so most chops are actually going to impact there. Okay, so if we assume that is our impact area there, but with the gladius, most of the time, certainly used with the large scutum, you tend to thrust with it. Not to say you can't cut with it, you can cut with it, but when you use one of these large shields, it actually becomes quite difficult to use a cutting sword, so you tend to thrust more because it's easier to do with a large shield held in front of you. So the impact area here is up at the tip, and actually that means that in terms of reach, this particular FALX and this particular gladius, so this is a bit large and this is not a particularly large one, is about the same. Now, one of the disadvantages therefore in using the FALX two-handed is you've got a really short reach for a two-handed weapon, and you're giving up any ability to protect yourself with a shield. If we look at the Tropaeum Traiani, for example, it shows the Dacians wearing no armour at all. Now, do we trust that? Well, that's a good question. I think it's probably a romanticised vision. Certainly we see the Dacians wearing armour on Trajan's column, and we see the piles of weapons that have been gathered from the Dacians on Trajan's column, and it shows helmets and shields and scale armour and so on and so forth. So I think certainly, and obviously there's variation in the army, so there are essentially massed levies within the Dacian army, and there were, nobles, and there were perhaps more like regular soldiers. We know that there's a strong suggestion that the Dacians had actually been undergoing a long period of Romanization. It wasn't simply a case of the Romans going to some foreign land, encountering some barbarians they had never encountered before, running around in animal skins with giant cleavers and fighting them and killing them. It wasn't as simple as that. The Dacians and the Romans have been interacting for a long, long time, and just as, in fact, all over the world that the Romans came into contact, there was cross-pollination of ideas and of culture and of language, but also of arms and armour. And so, if we're looking at Gaul, or we're looking at Britannia, or we're looking at Dacia, anywhere, Germania, anywhere we're looking where the Romans came into contact with, you could find equipment that was to some degree comparable with Roman equipment. So we see the spread of Roman style shields, we see the spread of Roman style helmets, which in fact was a Gallic style helmet originally. We see the spread of the pilum. And the gladius. So we absolutely see, and we can guess with a fair amount of surety based on the evidence we have to hand, that there was some degree of Roman influence already in Dacia before the Dacian campaigns. And so I find it very unlikely that all of the Dacians were running around shirtless. But it's not impossible that some were, and we also know that the Dacians did make use of other types of swords comparable to the gladius, with shields and with armour, and so it's possible that perhaps, like in later centuries, for example the Dane axe used at Hastings, it's possible that some of these weapons, the FALX, not so much the Sica, because the Sica is obviously intended to be used with a shield, but it is possible that the bigger two-handed versions of the FALX were given to elites, the equivalent of kind of berserkers or housecarls. They were given to perhaps guards, and if we look at the Byzantine sources later when the Rhomphaia is mentioned, it does seem that that is associated with guards to the emperor. So it is, and if we look at the Zweihande, the so-called Landsknechts in the 16th century, the Doppel soldiers that use these big two-handed swords, there's always this correlation or relationship between these kind of elite shock weapons where you give up protection like a shield or armour in order to use some really big lay down some sort of massive attack. There does seem to be association between those types of weapons and guards, bodyguards, elites, forlorn hopes, this type of thing, shock troops, grenadiers, so on. Okay, so in terms of how this was used, well, was it always used two-handed? I think this type that Iamandi has made, and again link below, and you can look at other examples he's made Sica, and he's made bigger examples and smaller examples. I think this particular type is essentially, in my mind, kind of like a bastard sword of the medieval period. So can you use it two-handed? Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a hefty thing. It's not nimble or light by any means, but it's not unwieldy, it's not ridiculous or anything like that. I do think, could you make this lighter? Yes, you could make this lighter, you could make this more nimble. Would you necessarily gain anything by that? Well, you'd make it a bit quicker, but if you're using this with a shield, then actually as a one-handed weapon, if it's a striking weapon, you don't actually necessarily want it to be overly light, because you want it when it strikes to have a good strong effect, whether it's on someone's shield or helmet or body or whatever. So you do want some heft to it. That being said, do I think this should be a little bit lighter than it is? I think possibly yes. And I think that this example probably has more meat in the blade than is conducive to using really well as a one-handed sword. And funnily enough, because of the length of this and the proportions and the fact that we've got that rib there almost encouraging you to use it as a one-handed sword, I do see this more like a Sica with an extended grip rather than what I would regard as a true FALX. So we do have a size and proportion issue here in relation to weight as well. Obviously when you've got a weapon that you're predominantly using two-handed, well, this is light two-handed. It's as light as a nimble longsword, but it doesn't have the length and reach of a nimble longsword. So I would argue for, if you're making something, decide whether you want it to be a predominantly two-handed weapon or predominantly one-handed weapon. And I would say that this one is kind of going in two different directions. In terms of the mass and the feel, it feels like a two-handed weapon, but in terms of the size, it feels like a one-handed weapon. So I'd be personally very interested to see Iamandi's one-handed Sica, and you know, in a way, with some mass reduced, this would be, I think, absolutely spot on as a one-handed sword, but a little bit short for a two-handed sword. Now, in terms of the quality of the production, well, I'm going to talk about that in a separate video. I really wanted to look at the history here and make you aware of the complications of talking about the FALX and the Sica and the Rhomphaia. And quite simply, these are actually something really interesting to research. And if you're, for example, an archaeology or history student, classic student, this would be an interesting subject to delve into, actually, because there's a there's a decent amount of art, archaeology and historical material to research, but at the same time there's debate on it, and there's contrasting and conflicting opinions on these things. My feeling is that probably those words were used for similar or different weapons by different people at different times. And it's a bit like when we go into the 16th or 17th centuries and we deal with the word sword and rapier and tuck and estoc and all of these things. Sometimes we argue about the terminology, but sometimes it's just that historical person used the words slightly differently to that historical person. So they're subjective, as language often is. So I'm going to wrap it up there. We will be coming back and looking at this weapon again in terms of what it does, and you know, I'll be talking a little bit perhaps about how you could use this with the scutum or with the shield. I'll perhaps be hitting things with it. Obviously I'll do some water bottles and wood and my typical targets, but I might also perhaps look at some striking it against shield or armour analogues, and we'll talk about it in context with some other weapons of the period like the pilum as well, and consider what place this maybe had historically, and how it was physically used as well, rather than just talking about its name and its importance in history. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. See you again soon for another video on the channel. Give us a like and a subscribe. Check out Iamandi's Facebook page below and have a look at his cool stuff that he's making. He's got a website as well, which is also linked below. We'll look at its construction and do a review of it in a video really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.